Welcome to the Teapot Reads. I'm the Teapot. This is what I'm currently reading and I am so happy to see you today. Hello, welcome to my channel. This is sort of a new-ish location. I think I've done vlogs here before and you might have seen this location pop up in another video. But when I came downstairs this morning, Tank was hanging out on this couch and I just wanted to film next to him because seeing him today brought me such just like he always brings me happiness when I see him. But this morning I saw him and I was just overcome with just joy and happiness. I don't know, some days it hits a little harder. So I just wanted to hang out with him. So I'm also probably going to be talking a little quieter. Also, it is thunderstorming outside today. This is my favorite weather. Unfortunately, I do have to go to work tomorrow. I mean, I do work tomorrow, but I have to work tonight, is what I meant to say. I do have to go to work tonight, so I have to drive in it. That's not always a lot of fun, but we're gonna make the best of it. What am I here for today? I am putting up my review From Blood and Ash. So I did well, it wasn't a dedicated reading vlog for this book, but I do have a reading vlog that kind of encompasses my thoughts for this book, and I'll link that around here and down below as well. But I thought it was only fair of me to sit down and talk about my thoughts on this book because I have a lot of them. So first of all, this is the lovely Illumicrate edition. I love this cover. This is the spine and the back, and then it's an embossed cover as well, which just made it such a pleasure to read. And then of course the stenciled edges. So gorgeous, physically a gorgeous book on every level. So points for that, I guess. But overall, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. And as I was reading it, I actually thought it was going to get a much higher review for me because I was really enjoying it for the most part. This book, I mean, it's pretty well written. It's a fantasy romance, so romance is definitely the focus, but I thought the plot was strong enough. I thought that while there were a lot of tropes, I didn't hate any of them. None of them felt tired or overdone. They all felt fine. They felt good. And overall, it was a fun, enjoyable read until about the last 100 pages or so when things really started to go downhill for me. Before I get into the review, I want to do a quick summary. You probably already know what this book and the series is about because it is so popular on BookTube and on BookTok and even on Insta. So basically, it follows Poppy. She is the maiden. She has basically been dictated by her society to be this role that's called the maiden. And we don't get 100% explanation of what that is, which I'll talk about my thoughts of a little later. But this means she has to literally be a maiden. She can't really interact with people. She has to kind of be above and beyond normal people. In her society, there are the Ascended, which are immortals, basically, and then there are regular folks, and then there are regular folks who also go and serve the gods at the temples and stuff. Those are the three big delineations. There are of course nobles and stuff, and she's actually raised by the Duke and Duchess, or she's living with them, at least she was partly raised by the Queen. So Poppy is a little less than a year out from her ascension, I believe. At the beginning of the book, it might even be sooner than that. It could be wrong on the timeline. And she is kind of, well, she's scared of the ascension and she's interested in the ascension, and she's finally really pushing the boundaries. So she starts doing little adventures, and on one of these adventures at the very beginning of the novel, she meets a mysterious stranger in a kind of seedy tavern, and they kind of go a little further than she's ever been before. And this is really, I mean, this is literally where the book starts, but this is also kind of where the book starts because, or the important part of the book starts, right at the beginning. I do appreciate that it launches right there. But from there, it's just Poppy sort of grappling with the forces that are starting to rise to take down her people. The fact that she has to be the maiden, even though she's not sure what that even means. She's not necessarily comfortable with what that means. She might want another life for herself. And Hawk, this mysterious stranger she met at the seedy tavern, ends up being assigned to her as one of her guards, and their relationship is really the focal point of this book. I went into this book not expecting to like it, which is totally unfair of me, but I had read other books by Jennifer L. Armentrout years and years ago, I read like the first 2 books in her Luck series, which is a paranormal romance series, and I did not jive with it. It was not for me. I don't think I will ever try anything else. She writes that as YA. This is an adult, new adult series. I could see it being like older YA, but it does have some sex scenes in it. So like, if you're uncomfortable reading that, or you're uncomfortable having a teenager read that, like, don't hand it to them. I think her writing is a bit just too, at least one of my problems with her writing in the Luck series was that it felt like it was not talking down, but like preventing itself from treating the reader the way it would another adult, I guess. So in a way it kind of felt a little bit like talking down. And this book did not falter from that. There was really no issue there, because I don't know, maybe her writing has gotten better. It has been a lot of years, or maybe just her voice has gotten better, or maybe me as a reader, I'm the demographic that she really wanted to write to, kind of thing. I'm not sure. I'm not going to guess, or I'm not going to be like, oh, this one for sure, because I don't know. The characters. I really liked Poppy. I didn't think I was going to like Poppy. The first chapter left me on very unsteady ground. I was like, okay, Poppy's an interesting character, but will I like her? I ended up really, really liking her. She's one of those characters that I have a very soft spot for. She is got a traumatic past and kind of present. Not kind of, but like a lot of the book she's put through trauma. She's put through a lot of trauma. She is very self-flagellating, like she blames herself, even if it's really not her fault for something to happen. She's very quick to be like, it's my fault, and on an internal level that I kind of like relate with. She is very much has to be the person who has to fix things. She is one of those characters who will put herself last, even though she kind of wants to put herself first, but knows she, or thinks she doesn't deserve it. And I really liked that. I really liked Hawk as well. I thought he was a much more nuanced alpha type character than we sometimes see in books like this, so I really did enjoy that. The side characters were all just okay. I didn't think any of them were particularly good or particularly bad. I hated Tawny's name. Tawny Lion, I thought was the stupidest name in the whole world. I actually really hated it, and it bothered me the entire time that this was her name. I also really disliked the naming convention in this book. Some of the names felt like they could be fantasy names. Some of them felt like they could be romance names, like Hawk. And some of them just felt like, well, there were weird names like Tawny, and then there were just like regular names. And I did not like the naming convention. I thought it felt very sloppy. And this is a little nitpick, but when I read fantasy, I really appreciate when you can tell that the author has taken the time to sort of theme the fantasy names. Like every region has a different sort of vibe to the name. And some authors go above and beyond this. Like I think Brandon Sanderson does like an intense job of it. But then there are some authors who they don't do such an intense job, but it still like comes across. I think J. Kristoff is a good example. Robin Hobb is a good example. She probably even leans closer to Sanderson. Like, Tad Williams is, I think, a good example. There are a lot of authors who just do it so well, and this book was all over the place. It felt so messy in the naming conventions, and it just bothered me. I know it's not a big thing. It doesn't really have an impact on the plot, so I didn't take away from the book. I didn't say, oh, well, I dislike the book because of this. It just, like, bothered me the entire time, especially as a writer, too. I try to, maintain these naming conventions when I'm writing fantasy because I think it just makes a more cohesive world, and while you can have outliers, so many of these names just felt all over the place, and I disliked it. The romance. I actually really enjoyed it until the last 100 pages. That's one of the major reasons I disliked the very ending of this book. There are going to be spoilers at the end of this video, but I am going to put up a banner here, be like, stop watching now if you don't want any spoilers. Most of my negative thoughts come in this spoiler section. Hold on. The dog's favorite game to play is to push his toys off the couch so that you have to pick it up and give it back to him. So most of my negative thoughts, especially on the relationship, happen at the end, and so are spoilers. So I will talk about it in more detail, but I don't want to talk about it now in spoiler detail. Basically, up until this point, I really liked the relationship. I really liked how Hawk treated Poppy. I really liked how he spoke to her. He was always affirming, and it didn't feel overly like flowery how he spoke to her. He spoke to her in a very real way. He spoke to her and would say things that, I mean, yeah, there were some contexts where he would like say things where you're like, okay, well, this is a fantasy world, of course this makes sense here. But there were a lot of times too when it felt very real world, where like any person would be lucky to hear their partner say these kinds of things. I also really liked how just like sex and relationship positive he was, and he didn't make Poppy, who has had no experience with this because she is the maiden, he didn't make her feel guilty or bad about that. So it is a fantasy book, and that means a lot of world building. I thought, while it's not my ideal type of world building, a lot of the times, especially with some of the reveals that happen at the end, I was just like, oh, I'm glad this was revealed at the end and not the beginning, because if it had been at the beginning, it probably would have thrown me off, because it's just not the type of fantasy I like to, or I find myself gravitating towards. That being said, I thought most of the world building was really solid. The only real issue I took with it was the maiden. I think, and I'm kind of split on it, because I think it's a really, really interesting concept, but we get so little of it. Like, I'm still not sure what it means beyond how it constrains Poppy and her life. I don't know what the maiden's role is, and it's touted as like a big thing, but we're never really given a clear idea of what it actually means to be the maiden. And that really frustrated me. I think it might be something that is revealed and talked about in later books. In fact, I'm pretty positive it will be to some degree, because otherwise, I'm not really sure what role the maiden plays, you know, in any of this. It's just like a big deal, and everyone in the world seems to have an idea that it's a big deal, but I'm also, in fact, like, I'm not convinced they know what the maiden is, and I have no idea what the maiden is, so it was just really frustrating in that regard. Otherwise, I do think everything that we've gotten about the maiden so far, I do find that interesting. I do think that's a really cool concept to put in this book, and I think it fits really well. It's also a sort of character archetype that it's in some ways sort of like a chosen one type character without being the chosen one type character directly. And I liked that. It was sort of like adjacent to that. I thought that was cool. Other than that, yeah, I thought the world building was fine. It was good. It was strong enough to carry the book. Yeah, except for the names. Like you know, I disliked the naming conventions in this book. I guess I should talk a little bit about the monsters and stuff. They felt kind of generic, but not like generic in a way that they weren't still somewhat interesting. I still understood that they were a threat and still believed that they were a threat. I just don't even remember what they are called. They're basically vampires and werewolves, and also like monsters that are like uncontrollable vampires type vampires. Like, I get it. I understood it while reading it. The lingo didn't stick with me. I'm not holding it against the book because it's partly a me thing. I have a hard time holding on to names of things like that. But still, if it was really something interesting and cool, it probably would have stuck with me. So, you know, take it as you will. If you read a lot of books and you don't have a good mind for minor details like that, a lot of the minor details in this book are probably going to go right out of your head when you walk away from it. And the last thing I want to talk about before going into my specific, I don't know if you can see because the edges, but I have a bunch of, yeah, you can't see that. I have a bunch of sticky notes that I kind of want to talk about in detail. Before I go into that, the last thing I wanted to talk about were the plot twists. I'm not going to say what they were. I probably won't even say what they were specifically in the spoiler section, but I knew what they were. And I knew what they were because I had seen the spoilers online, and also because they were very predictable. I think if I had been reading this book a lot quicker, because I think if I wasn't working, if all I was doing was reading, I would have like zoomed through this. I already read it fairly quickly for what it was. But because I had enough time to really sit and think on the stuff, even if I hadn't known what these spoilers were going to be, I would have figured them out. Very similar to a lot of other surprises that are just happening in fantasy at the moment, especially YA and NA fantasy. It's also laid out fairly well for the reader. Like, there are enough breadcrumbs even from right at the beginning that you're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I didn't have a problem with knowing what the surprise was gonna be. I appreciate that it happens at the end of book 1 rather than like the end of, say, book 2 or 3, because it was so obvious. There are some books that do similar surprises that I definitely didn't see coming, and even on the reread I'm like, oh, I could have seen it coming, but it would have been harder, and I'm glad that it held off as long as it did. This one, I'm glad that these surprises were revealed in this book, because otherwise I would have ended the book thinking, God damn it, I know exactly what is going to happen, and now I have to wait for book 2. But that's it for like overview stuff. I'm now going to talk about specifics. And I am going to say chapter number, not page number, just because there are so many editions of this book. I don't even know how they align with each other. And if you're curious and want to look at the exact things I'm kind of referring to, I think chapter number will be most helpful. So first of all, in chapter 3, I put a sticky here, I think for the first interaction between Poppy and Hawk. So their first interaction is pretty amorous, and I just wanted to say I really appreciated that. I don't read a lot of smut, like it's not my go-to anything, but I appreciate it when there's good smut in a book, and I think there's good chemistry between the characters. I thought even this early, before we, the readers, knew anything about the characters and before the characters even knew that much about each other, I thought their chemistry was great. This is something that is so hard to put on page. I am always in awe of authors who can do it this early on. It's great. Their chemistry is great. And even though it wasn't like a super fulfilling moment of a relationship, because it wasn't a relationship so much as just an encounter, I still felt like it was a good encounter. I still felt like it was enjoyable as a reader, and probably for the characters as well, which is awesome. Really appreciated that. Really appreciated everything about this scene. There was a lot of consent going on. It was great. It was great. Later this same chapter, I have tabbed this quote, "What he'd done, it belonged to just me." I really liked that way of looking at this encounter. Poppy doesn't know who this person is, not really, and this person doesn't really know who Poppy is, not really, not like as people. And all the same, I liked how positively she looked on this encounter. We don't see a lot of stories where, I'm not gonna say this is a one-night stand because that's not what it is, but that's the closest I could relate it to. And I don't think we see a lot of stories where those are depicted as positive. Now, if it wasn't the main love interest, I don't know if it would have still been depicted as positive, but I don't know that it wouldn't have been. This book very much is a sex-positive book, and I approve of that. I think that we need to see more of that, especially of not shaming characters who haven't had experience, because not everyone has had experience by the age. I think Poppy is like early 20s, if I remember correctly. Not everyone has experience by that age, and it's not a shameful or bad thing. And it doesn't mean that they can't as much enjoy these sort of encounters. And anyway, I just really enjoyed Poppy's thinking of "it belonged to me." It just feels very quiet and very happy. Like, this is something she had that she can't give back. And especially as we learn later in the series, or later in the book, she's had a lot of traumatic and horrible experiences, and she has this really nice one now to own as well, and I really liked that. Okay, chapter 11. This is the chapter where Hawk has been assigned to guard Poppy. I wanted to talk about a couple things. I wanted to talk about Poppy's appearance, and I wanted to talk about Hawk's reaction to it, and also the Duke and Duchess a little bit. But first, Poppy's appearance. Maybe it's just me and I missed something along the way, which is possible because I'm not the best at visualizing characters the way they're depicted. I don't read visually, like I can't picture things happening as I'm reading. I just don't have like pictures in my head. It doesn't happen. But online, everyone is like, Poppy is a plus-size, curvier character, which I fully support and love to see more of. But I don't I don't remember there being any point where like that's like depicted or said, so I'm confused as to why that's like where are these like descriptions coming from. I fully support it as someone who is plus size and curvy, and like I want more characters like this. Like Nina Zinnik is one of my favorite characters in large part because of the representation she provides, but I never felt like that was being represented with Poppy, and maybe it's something that is clearer in later books, but I'm just confused with this book. I didn't see that description anywhere. And when she talks about things she's like concerned about regarding her appearance, she never talks about like weight or size or shape. She's very much focused on her scars, which I mean, fair, they're probably a much bigger noticeable thing, you know, but I don't know, I didn't see anything pointing towards this representation that I had been told was going to be in here, so I don't know what's going on with that. I don't know if it was me as a reader missing it. I don't know if it's like a leader book thing. I don't know. As for her scars, I really liked that she had scars on her face. Characters with scars are really interesting to me. I have like some small scars, like I have one on my forehead, and one under my chin, but like I don't know anyone with like major scars anywhere, or I don't know them well, and I think it's always really interesting to feature characters with scars like this that get to be just put on the page and represented, and especially making your main character, a female main character, have very clear scars on her face is a very bold move that I really liked. No one looks perfect, and as much as it's kind of fun to have main characters who are perfect and beautiful and whatnot, like Selena Sardathian, it's also very much more realistic and enjoyable and easier to connect with as a reader to have a character like Poppy, who's not perfect looking, who has visible proof of trauma she has been through, especially considering she has a lot of invisible scars from that trauma and more trauma. I really liked that. I also really love Hawke's response to seeing her scars, which is both halves are as beautiful as the whole. I really loved that. I thought that was the most eloquent way to say it, and just all around the most positive and affirming way he could have said it. I thought that was great. I of course hated the Duke for so many reasons, but particularly in the way he treats Poppy and her scars, as if her scars are like defining when she has come through so much, and he uses them as a weapon. Like, what scum? I mean, he's scum across the board. There's nothing I can say beyond, like, he's scum and I hated him, and there are some very satisfying things that my hate feels good about, I guess. The Duchess, though, she is a really interesting character, and I hope we see more of her in future books, because she is a lot more complicated than your run-of-the-mill side character in these books. Her husband and her relationship, you know, we don't know what it is exactly. Is he abusive to her? How much does she know, like, how he treats Poppy, how he treats other people? And we don't know what their relationship is. We don't know what her role in these abuses are. And I can't say she's irredeemable, but I can't say she's redeemable anyway. She's really complicated. I feel like there's so much more going on with her, and I really hope we get more of her. Okay, speaking of abuses, so now we're in chapter 13. Poppy is whipped. This is a horrible scene, but I will be the first person to admit I kind of like to see characters tortured on page, because when they ultimately get their revenge or they get to a better place, you know, they get their power, when that happens, it is so cathartic. And it wouldn't be so cathartic if we didn't see the horrors happening on page. So yeah, this is like a horrible scene, and like I'm not happy it's happening because that's not good. But at the same time, one of my guilty pleasures as a reader is to see these horrible things happen so that later on, when karma hits, it feels so fucking good as a reader. So I liked this scene, and also I liked the caramel. Okay, chapter 15, and we have my first thing I disliked. The fight scenes. And really all I have to say is I thought the fight scenes were incredibly boring to read. They just weren't written well. A lot of writers can't do fight scenes. I didn't really hold it against the book. It just was boring, and I kind of ended up being like, God, this went on too long, and it didn't even go on that long. I don't think it even lasted a chapter, but it went on too long. One-on-one fight scenes are a little better, but like the battle scene that happens in chapter 15 was so boring and droll, and I just like, ugh, not a fan. Oh, okay. Chapter 20, when Hawk like defends Poppy. I had seen so many people talk about this part of their dynamic on especially BookTok, and people just like loved it, how he like, just the way he defends her. And I'm not saying that like women need to be defended all the time, but he is in the position to literally defend her. He's a guard, and just the way he does it, especially when no one else had stood up for her in these ways. Oh my God, I loved that part of their dynamic. The chemistry was so good. These moments were so good. I just lived for them. I absolutely lived for scenes where he's like, don't fucking touch her. Okay? Like, oh, it was so good. Another thing that like in general I really liked, Hawk says several times, it's like, you're so violent, Poppy. But he's like always like gleeful about it. And Poppy is violent. I really liked that. I don't know if I'm like a physically violent person, but I'll like say violent things sometimes. Not like meanly or threateningly. I guess almost jokingly. I'll be like, you do that and I'll punch you. You know, I just really liked that Poppy was like violent, and Hawk is like, good, be violent, it's fun. I really like that because yeah, I am like a violent person in a way too. I saw some resonation with me and Poppy and those small scenes, and I just like how it's not seen as a bad thing, especially because she's not like, I mean, she acts on it a little bit, but not in like a way that harms innocence. You know, she's not like hurting people. She's not genocidal, but she's like, man, this man is abusing me. I wish he was fucking dead. And Hawk is like, you're so violent. I love that. And I'm like, yes, Poppy, kill him. You know. This is the spoiler portion of the video, and this is me talking about the consent violations. I shouldn't say it's that extreme, but the like consent issues that happen in the last chunk of this book. There were some things that I was plainly like, this isn't a consent violation so much as just incredibly unsexy in a way that's depicted to be sexy, because it sort of walks that really narrow line between consensual and non-consensual, and I just disliked it, and it made me personally uncomfortable. And then there was like one particular big scene that was just, yeah, I'm pretty sure there wasn't consent given, so don't know how I feel about it. Well, I feel bad about it, but like, I don't know if it's gonna be something that's like dealt with in a later book. I just don't know. So I don't want to write it off completely. I feel like this series, because it is so sex positive, has an opportunity to discuss this in more nuance and detail. So I'm not going to write it off completely, but it really soured this book for me. And I'm going to be talking about specific moments. So we're starting at the beginning of chapter 33. When Hawk says, there's no way I could be in that bed with you and not be all over you in 10 seconds flat. We wouldn't even make it to the bed before that happened. I know my limitations. I know that I'm not a good enough man to remember my duty and yours, or that I'm so incredibly unworthy of you it would be a sin. Even knowing that, there is no way I wouldn't strip that robe from you and do exactly what I told you I'd do when we were in that forest. So on one hand, I appreciate that Hawk is like, look, if I did this, like I'm letting you know that I'm coming to my limit. But on the other hand, it kind of feels like he's not blaming her, but very much being like, you're just too much for me. I can't control myself around you. Like, that's not sexy. What if she really needed you there and wasn't ready for sex, and you're like, well, I'm sorry, I just can't control myself. You're too much for me. You're overpowering. That's not okay, Hawk. That is a horrible thing to say. Like, put yourself in Poppy's shoes. What if you're like, I just need like physical contact right now. I just need you like near me. I'm afraid. I'm concerned, there's a lot going on, I'm overwhelmed, and your partner who you trusted was like, well, I can be there for you, but it has to be sex. I just can't control myself past that. Whether that's true or not, whether they're trying to sound sexy or not, that would be the most upsetting thing to hear, that they just disregard what you need. That's just how I feel about that. But it's not complete consent violation because, she does end up being like, well, I want to have sex. Like, she's pretty clear about it. But then later in chapter 36, this is after the reveal where we know he's like Prince Castile and all this, and he's kind of playing this game like, how much was real, how much wasn't real. And he says, you had no problem, or no, she says, don't touch me. And he says, you had no problems with me touching you last night. That's not okay. Consent does not mean it's okay every time. Consent once just means consent in that moment. You're not consenting for the future when you're consenting for the moment. And I disliked that he was, again, even though he might have been playing up the role of like evil, he's playing into these horrible little stereotypes that some people actually believe. A lot of abusive relationships are built on, well, one time you said it was okay. Well, no, one time does not mean every time. So I really, really disliked this. Then we have on chapter 39, when they have sex in the snow. She literally stabs him, is upset, goes running outside. Then he basically tackles her and they start like fucking, which is fine, but it's not really hot because, again, there really wasn't consent. As a reader, I felt like Poppy was too distressed to even really give consent. She was upset for, oh no, we've lost power. Power might come back on. There, it's back. So Poppy, I felt like she was too distressed to give consent. Hawk doesn't even really ask her. They just kind of start going at it. And in the end, she's not like upset or anything, but it felt very weird. It felt very strange. It felt very much like it was supposed to be hot and it wasn't. It kind of felt borderline like rape. Again, like if I was in Poppy's shoes and my partner who had been lying to me and who I literally just stabbed was like, okay, we're gonna fuck now, I would have been like, wow, that's not okay. And then the final one I have is on chapter 41. And Poppy says, see, that's where you're wrong. I have options. I'd rather starve than eat with you, your highness. He says, that's where you're wrong. You don't have options when it comes to your own well-being and your own foolish stubbornness. She says, excuse me. I won't let you weaken or starve yourself because you're mad. And I do get it. I get why you're upset, why you want to fight me and everything, every step of the way. He took a step toward me and my spine locked up as I refused to back away. His eyes burned brighter. I want you to, princess. I enjoy it. So this is a little more complicated for me. On one hand, I really hate that he's telling her she doesn't have options, because especially as someone who in her situation literally didn't have any options, she's exacting some control over her life, and it's not necessarily healthy. Like, she's saying she'll starve herself. That's not a healthy coping mechanism. But he's literally telling her, a person who just came out of, and I mean, she's basically being put in a different sort of captivity, but he's telling her she doesn't have options. He's controlling this part of her life. I think that's very toxic. Now, I will say, like, he's saying she's not allowed to hurt herself, and yeah, that's good. That's what you do to people you love. You don't let them hurt themselves. But saying it like that just really upset me as someone who has had a history with mental health, especially like trying to exert control over my life in not always positive or healthy ways. If someone had told me I wasn't allowed to do that, I would just continue to find more drastic and horrible ways to exert little controls over my life. And he's basically telling Poppy, you can't control this aspect of your life. You have no control again. And also, their relationship post the snow moment is not great. So again, feel very weird about the consent in that moment. But that's what I'm gonna say on that. Again, I think that the later books might tackle it just because the book is so sex positive. There's so much about sex, so much about relationships, and it is an adult series, so there's definitely room and space for these things to be talked about in nuance. All right, so like I said at the beginning, 3.5 stars. I'm gonna leave y'all before the storm gets even worse and you can't hear me. This isn't a great microphone as it is, so it might be bad, but goodbye. I hope you are doing well. I hope you find yourself in a place where you are comfortable and safe and you're riding out your very own storms. I hope if it's cold where you're at, you're staying warm, and if it is warm where you're at, you're staying comfortable, and I hope you're reading a great book. I will see you next time. Bye.